Lance, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Very good. Let me just check my audio mixer. I can see things moving, which looks promising. So I think we are good to go, and we're live. Welcome to episode 12 of Calico Live. My name is Chris Tompkins. I'm lead developer advocate at Tigera. My role is to champion our user needs and to support our Project Calico users, and to support our contributors and to help them to see eye to eye. I'm sorry that people have heard this now many times if they've been watching for a while, but I've been in networking since 2000. I came in through kind of traditional Cisco and Juniper IP networking and became interested in software-defined networks and automation, and that led me to Kubernetes and Calico, and here I am. Our guest today is Lance Robson. Lance, did you want to introduce yourself, or shall I introduce you?
Either is good.
I'll go for it, and you can add on anything that I miss. So Lance is
Sure.
a senior software engineer at Tigera. He specializes in software testing for Calico. He is incredibly nerdy in a positive way, and he and I have had many interesting conversations about a lot of things. In his spare time, he likes to build robots, which is fantastic. I've toyed with getting involved in this, but I just don't know if I can find enough spare time because it seems to chew up a lot of time. Anything else you want to say about yourself, Lance?
No, that pretty much covers
Just
it.
about covers it. All right, brilliant. So Calico Live is an occasional informal live video stream. We're up to episode 12 already, which is amazing. We're averaging around one a month when you consider holidays and so on, but it tends to be somewhere between bi-weekly and once a month. And the idea is that we kind of relax and chat in an informal way. So there is a very loose script, but we are happy to deviate from it. And indeed, we want to deviate from it. So if you're listening and you have any questions and you want to get involved, feel free to ask them. There's no question that's too easy or too hard. If it's off topic, we can either answer it if we feel able, or we can come back to you. So up to episode 5, Calico Live was focusing on our eBPF data plane exclusively. Then we had episode 6, which is a special for Calico Live's for Calico's 5th birthday with Ratan Tipinelli, our CEO. And since then, we've been talking from two different team members to kind of dig into different areas of the project. So that's where we're up to. So today, episode 12, we published a loose agenda. We're just discussing software testing generally and how it relates to Calico specifically. I think we'll probably spend a good first half of the session just talking about Lance's background and about software testing generally, and anecdotes and so on before we dive into Calico. So depending on your available time, feel free to skip forward if you're watching the recording, or come back to us. So Lance, a little bit about you before we dive into other things. How did you get into software and tech in the first place? I'm betting it was when you were quite young, if I know you.
Yeah, I think like many folks my age, my first introduction to coding was typing in the code for games in BASIC on a ZX Spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, you and me both.
Yep. And at university, we got taught Pascal, although I did my final project in Java, and the final project was a walking robot. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
There's a theme here.
Yeah, there definitely is. So I quite like how when you talk about what languages you learn at school/university, you're kind of aging yourself, depending on, so I reckon I can guess from that, because I did Pascal at school, and then Java at university. So I would say that places us around the same place, I think. Cool. And how about? Did you know that you wanted to work in software, or did that just kind of did that happen? Did you do anything before that?
It just kind of happened. So my first job was actually at Nortel. So I was a product engineer on the Optera long haul DWDM optical transmission system. Mm-hmm. So it's capable of carrying like 800 gigabits per second of Sonnet SDH on a single fiber pair, which was a lot for those days.
Yeah.
But definitely not software. But it did involve a bit of testing. So So as a product engineer, one of the things I did was trials and demos. So quite often we get we get customers in saying, "Yep, I've heard what your sales guys say. I want to see it actually do what you say it does."
Yeah.
And so you'd set up like a miniature network in the lab, with actual spools of fiber, showing the system carrying the data over like hundreds of kilometers. And then they'd come in and you'd show them round, and you'd do whatever testing they needed to do. To prove it did what our sales guys said it did.
Yeah,
and we had varying levels of suspicion, So I remember one guy memorably came into the lab, and I explained the layout of the network setup we had for him. He said, "Right, so if I pull this out,
right, yeah, he didn't believe it. Okay, got it.
We should get alarms on all of those places," and he did it, and they came up. So
yeah, I think that's still a thing, and sometimes I'm that person. Sometimes, especially with SDN stuff, there can be so much smoke and mirrors. Not so much with Calico actually, because we've talked about this before many times on this podcast actually, about how the technologies that underlie Calico are actually quite visible things, and you can inspect them quite easily. But yeah, especially with kind of OpenFlow and things like that, I can remember seeing many kind of slideware things and wanting to dig behind it and see how it worked.
Yep.
Cool. Whenever you talk about SDN, it makes me really aware of how in our field people can specialize so much at a certain layer. Because you and I can have a very detailed conversation about TCP, but you'll lose me incredibly quickly if you go deep into SDN. Sorry, not SDN, SDH, and physical stuff.
Yep.
I'm not so great at that stuff, to be honest with you.
It's a real niche skill. And that's another theme that seems to have gone through my career is niche stuff. So my job after that moved to a company testing voice over IP telephony systems, and I really enjoyed the kind of the niche protocols. So things like MGCP, Megaco, SIP, ISDN, MTP2, and MTP3, and that sort of.
I know
that sort of weird stuff.
I think I knew what 4 of those were. I didn't know the others. Yeah. That's quite interesting that you like the niche protocols, because I think it's quite different to my personality. I find that the more niche a protocol, the less likely it's just going to work. And I like things that work straight away. But
telephony things are pretty reliable.
Yeah, they kind of have to be, I suppose. Yeah.
Because telephony has a very different idea of what reliable means.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think Calico is probably the most mainstream thing I've ever done.
Yeah, and well, that's an interesting. Actually, I'm going to put that to one side for a sec, because that is quite an interesting thing. Because I'll try to remember to come back to that, because I've got some thoughts on that, but they tie in better later on, I think. So you kind of already answered how you got into networking, because we know that you were at Nortel. So we know the answer to that. I'm just looking at my notes here to see if there's anything else we should mention. Not really. Oh yeah, the software. Yeah, so how did you get into the software stacks for networking? I don't think you said that really.
Yeah. Okay. So the company that was doing the voice over IP phone systems, they also did network protocol stacks. So they sold software chunks to router companies and that sort of thing. And yeah, so I ended up getting moved to the protocols division there, and was testing software stacks for routers, and that typically means spinning up virtual routers on VMware back then, and setting up networks of those and checking that they all that the network converges and all that stuff.
Interesting. When I was dealing with, actually that ties into our testing stuff for later on, definitely. In fact, I'm gonna put that to one side as well, because that's a whole minefield in its own interesting way.
Yes.
But I know you well enough to know that the minefield complexity, you quite enjoy how much there is there, because okay, we'll come back to that. I have a personal question. I think I've said this to you many times, so I'm not this is not new to you, but you and Sean, who's also been on this podcast many times, are kind of directly responsible for me joining Calico, because in my early adoption of Calico as a user, obviously like everyone on that journey, I was ramping up pretty hard to learn. And your engagement in Calico users, both you and Sean, it's incredible how you manage to get your day jobs done and simultaneously be as helpful as you are in Calico users. So I wondered how you manage that, because I find it difficult to context switch and to provide high quality answers in Calico users, as well as getting the other things I'm committed to doing done. I wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, I don't know, is the honest answer. It just kind of happens. So I view the whole being on Calico users and listening to what users are saying about the stuff we've shipped as being just an extension of testing. So it's kind of like, the feedback, closing the loop. It's finding out, learning about all the bugs that you accidentally shipped, the ones that you should have caught, and hearing directly from people that it's affecting, so that you can then go back and fix up the process, so we never ship that bug again, or bugs like it, ideally.
Yes.
So I basically view it as just being part of my day job. But yes, sometimes context switching between that can be kind of fun.
Yeah. No, it's a really valid point though, that obviously we aim to catch, and we'll talk more about this later, but we aim to catch as much as we can before it ships, of course. But no software will ever ship without bugs, because that's not the nature of software. Although I remember learning at university about functional languages that you can theoretically, mathematically prove, and all this kind of stuff. It's very interesting, but yeah, academic really. But yeah, that idea of trying to informally through Calico users, but also potentially formally through Calico users, capture the amount of chatter about certain topics is an interesting area for me. But we have to be obviously mindful of privacy and data protection and all the other things we have to be mindful of. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? That obviously if your users start to speak suddenly more about something, then you probably want to take a look at that thing.
Indeed.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, cool.
And questions in Calico users often come in clusters.
Yes, they do.
I don't know how that happens, or there's probably some maths behind it or something.
Yeah, there probably is. I've been guilty of the opposite, and I think you would probably agree as well, with Calico users, where I've seen 2 or 3 things and assumed that meant that there was a correlation, and there really wasn't. It was just that they happened to be, because that's how life is. Things get mentioned in. So
yes,
it's definitely not a perfect science, but it's something I want us to get better at, and we have some ideas around that. Cool. So let's go right back to kind of the start of testing, as far back as you were able to in your career. And being frank, I have some concepts of testing, but I've never done it as part of my career. So how has testing changed, or my kind of cheat sheet says improved, but I'm going to change that to changed. How has software changed / testing changed / improved in the time that you've been doing this?
That's an interesting question, and actually quite a hard one for me, because I'm beginning to realise that I've never worked anywhere that did testing in a traditional way. So I used to go along to the London Tester Gathering years ago, and we heard all sorts of horror stories from people who worked there, or people who went there. And I strongly I strongly suspect that part of that is that my previous employer, they only hired developers. And some of those developers went into test, and some of those developers went into customer support, and some of those developers went into operations. And so they were kind of doing DevOps before DevOps was even a thing.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's and and people used to cycle around between those different groups as well, and there was a lot of, well, some of the problems I've heard about at other places are down to the idea that testers are somehow lower than in the pecking order than devs, and it's never been like that for me, which is probably weird.
There's a whole interesting area of kind of human psychology about that, isn't there? About needing to give people who are being critical sufficiently a sufficiently loud enough voice and for them to be heard. There's a really famous, sorry to go somewhere dark with it, but there's a really famous plane crash that was caused by a co-pilot being ignored. And in the aviation industry, I'm sure someone who watches this will know what I'm talking about. It's very famous because it was recognised that the problem was the authority, the fact that the co-pilot knew exactly what was going wrong, but wasn't listened to because of the and that's interesting because there's no point hiring someone to test your software if they're not heard. But it sounds like your experience is that they have been.
Everywhere that I've worked, they have been, and I suspect that's the unusual part. So I mean, you know how I interact with the devs here. I don't think there's any opinion that test is somehow a less difficult skill than dev. It just has a different focus.
That's definitely my feeling. Yeah, for sure. In fact, we've talked about unit testing and so on, and I can knock up some code that does a job, but I don't know how to test it effectively. To me, if anything, it's harder. But certainly it's it feels to me within Project Calico and within Tigera that it's treated as critical. I mean, at the end of the day, you're protecting everyone from us getting bitten by something.
We're affected. At the end of the day, we're all one big team trying to ship software that just works for as many people as possible. That's
so. The other thing I wonder though is, because if we swing back around to the original question, which is how has the landscape changed? The other thing that jumps out to me is that you said you'd never seen somewhere that did it traditionally, or that you personally had never worked somewhere that done it traditionally. When that's happened to me in my career, that has sometimes made me wonder if that's because no one does it the way it's written down. And when I was a consultant doing network deployments, I knew some formal knowledge but I went out and saw hundreds of deployments and never saw things done the way they were supposed to be done, or virtually never. And it made me think, oh, that's interesting that actually what the book says is just not reflective of what people are actually doing. So that's quite interesting.
Maybe. Yeah. Although again, those horror stories from
true. Yeah, and that's a really good environment to be getting those stories from. Cool. Okay.
Yes.
So before we dive more into testing Kubernetes and testing in Kubernetes and how it relates to Calico, I wondered, while we're still talking about you and your background, I've been watching some stuff with my kids about build and design, and some of this is, as a lot of parents have, a lot of this is kind of sneakily educational. So I'm talking about people like Mark Rober or Adam Savage on YouTube, who they build and solve problems, and they do so with a clear workflow, and you kind of accidentally learn an awful lot of things about a scientific mindset. And I wondered what kind of content you might know about that, aside from those two, that fits into that, or anything that you think is interesting along those lines.
Gosh, yes, there's definitely stuff like that. Let's see.
I feel like you've told me about a couple of them. Go again.
Smarter Every Day is great.
Yeah, Smarter Every Day is great. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Definitely one to watch with the kids, that one.
Yeah, fantastic.
And then there's who's the guy who was on Smarter Every Day?
It's not
who built a blank powered baseball bat.
Wasn't that Mark Rober? I think that was Mark Rober. Yeah. Not the rocket powered baseball bat, no.
So Mark's definitely done stuff in this area, so he definitely did like a rocket powered golf club and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe I'm confusing them now. Yeah.
Yeah. So this guy, he took a baseball bat and put blanks in it, and and then when you hit the ball in just the right spot, the part of the bat flies off, and the blanks fired, and the ball goes off into the distance. He's also done. I'm gonna have to go and look it up now. Sorry.
Yeah, go. No, take your time. And while you're doing that, I can just fill and say, yeah, I just love these things because there's so much scientific process going on, and you can learn so much. And on the one hand, it's quite entertaining to watch something explode, but on the other hand, there's so much to learn about what a good process looks like. A lot of these YouTubers are actually starting to productize this with training courses and things because I think they realize that they've got an opportunity there.
Yes, and I mean, the thing you see in the video is always the tip of the iceberg, right?
Right, of course.
It's there must be like thousands of hours of building something involved, and then cut down into a 10-minute video or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have to fail so many times to succeed, don't you? At the end of the day.
Yes. Actually, Simone. Oh, what's her name?
Simone Getz.
We're almost certainly butchering that, but yes.
Yes.
So she's great because she shows you the failures,
yeah.
Which is a thing that basically no other YouTuber does.
Yeah.
And again, when I'm watching videos with the kids, although she's possibly not as family friendly as some of the others, but yeah. Yeah, she's quite. She definitely has the whole making mistakes and making. So her original thing was crappy robots, and it's as you said, so much of engineering is the default position in the process is it doesn't work.
Yeah, something.
Kind of at the end.
This one might actually directly relate to Kubernetes as well, and our conversation that we're going to get into about Kubernetes testing. But I think Mark Rober made this point that stuck with me, which is that you can't know if you've got the optimal solution to a problem until you've seen a lot of other solutions. Because how do you know if your solution is performing well if you haven't seen a load of things perform badly? Everything's relative, right? So hitting on the perfect solution straight away is actually a bad thing, because then you either just go ahead and assume and have no data about nothing to compare it to, or you're going to stress yourself out by making a lot of things that are worse. It's quite fascinating, really.
Yes.
Okay, so let's dive into testing.
Stuff made here. I finally found it. Stuff made here is the guy.
Stuff made here? I don't even think I've heard of that one. Let me make a quick note of that myself. I've not heard of that one, I don't think. Right, she is going on my list after this. Cool. So moving into, there is another question that I'm going to skip over. We may come back to it. But to start talking about kind of software testing for networks, when you were talking about testing earlier on, and I said we'll try to come back to this, you were talking about virtual routers and testing in VMware and so on. I have found in my previous experience that building networks for testing is a uniquely hard problem, because I had a complex data center scenario that I needed to test once with some Junipers, and these Junipers were expensive bits of kit, and they were good bits of kit. They were expensive because they were good. But building a lab with spare kit was an absolute no-no. There was no way I could afford to do so. And these devices were based on hardware ASICs, and the control plane was running on x86, but obviously the control plane was running on some relatively low-spec x86 stuff that a switch or a router has in it, because it's not as powerful as your laptop. But the ASICs are obviously monumentally more powerful at their specific job. And I found that even trying to do the right thing and to mock the whole environment up in the software that was available to me at the time led to me having something that in no way resembled the reality of what the hardware would actually do, because by the time you factor in the ASICs and the performance difference and the latency differences and everything else, it was meaningless. And I wondered how much that problem maps onto your experience and onto testing Calico.
Right. Okay. So I guess so back when I was doing that stuff with this company that was doing router, router software,
Hmm.
they kind of didn't have that problem because you can always like just write, instead of having your router software on the router, you can have another copy of that router,
Hmm.
another set of that router hardware, and talk to the ASICs directly with your test software.
Right.
So literally run, the two things back to back.
Hmm.
Now, there's a whole class of bugs there you can get with that are symmetric. So you need to be a teeny bit careful about that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, but it's but yeah, they basically didn't have that problem because they were writing the software that talked to the ASICs on the router side. They
Hmm.
also were writing. You could totally write the test version of that software,
So
and we
presumably,
did.
did they have, or did you slash they have problems in the interoperability space then? Because obviously, so much of networking is about writing things that conform to RFCs and behave well when they speak to other vendors who are implementing the same RFCs badly or differently. Differently, we should say. Um,
Yes.
but because they're on the other side of the fence, it's assumed that it's badly. No,
Yes.
yeah. Jokes aside, that must have been a challenge, though, right? Because you don't have all the other vendors' kit, and
Yes.
yeah,
So they used to specifically, and in fact, routers. My understanding is that there are kind of interop events where router manufacturers will take their latest and greatest and plug them all together,
there are,
um,
yeah.
and
Something I never managed
so
to get
that helps a
invited to.
lot.
I'd have liked to have, though.
So that helps a lot. Also, yes, having lots of third-party kit from lots of different vendors is definitely a good plan.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, sometimes you can do a little bit of that without like testing everything to its limit. Um,
So in our in the case of Calico, well, actually, I'm going to take a moment to just say I can see that we've got a few people online. So as I said right at the very start, we're happy to be derailed. In fact, we like being derailed. So if there's anything here that you want to chip in on, I've got the YouTube comments here, and I'll see them. There's nothing today that we have to cover, so feel free to derail us and with interesting slash challenging questions, and we'll have a go at them. So with that said, I'll keep an eye on that and see if we do get anything. And if not, people are always willing to join, always welcome to join us on Calico users. And some people don't necessarily like to ask their questions, on a YouTube stream. I can understand that. So if you prefer to chat to us on Calico users, join us and chat to us there. Calico users being our Slack community, which you can find if you probably. To be fair, you should be able to Google Calico user Slack. I think that ought to get you to it. Now, where was I going with that? I've totally lost my train of thought.
Derailed yourself.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, that's terrible as well because I had somewhere good to go with that.
Can I?
Yeah, dive in and you might rescue me and I'll hopefully remember what I
Maybe.
was about to say.
So, when it comes to like generating traffic, the thing about a Kubernetes cluster is it's basically a botnet.
Yeah, I suppose it is.
And it's totally possible in the same way as like you can turn router, by putting different software on a router, you can turn it into equipment for testing routers.
Mm-hmm.
You can turn a Kubernetes cluster into a tool for testing Kubernetes clusters.
Mm.
So if you're testing,
Yeah, I
if you want
suppose.
to do web load,
Uh-huh.
there's nothing to stop you spinning up 1,000 node GKE cluster
Mm.
and running Locust on that, and having Locust, 1,000 VMs worth of Locust slamming your application and into oblivion.
Yeah, do you know? I'd never heard that. I've literally never heard the botnet analogy before. But I actually quite like that because it's very true, isn't it? It's and I think that the reproducibility as well of Kubernetes, the fact that it's all declarative, that makes it more easy to recreate test cases and hopefully theoretically to recreate bugs. Is that fair, or is that
Yeah.
is that
I mean,
theoretical or practical?
eventually, it's the whole eventually consistent thing, right?
Right.
So it will get there. It may not start off quite there.
I don't
And
know
so
if I'm just thinking our viewers might not know what eventual consistency is.
Okay.
Is that something you can take? That's a bit of a dark, hard question to just randomly throw at you. Do you reckon you could have a stab at defining it? If you,
I can give the basics, but you really want someone like Sean, someone really
Yeah.
technical for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Really into computer science.
give the one liner and we can look it up later.
So with Kubernetes, you know, eventual consistency is so you write everything declaratively. You tell
Mhm.
the system what you want,
Mhm.
and then after a while, it will get there.
It will get there, yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. Which is why I suppose to give a particular example because people see this all the time just without realizing they're seeing it. So, for example, when you install the Tigera operator and then you give the Tigera operator a manifest to deploy Calico, some time passes, and at the end of that time, depending on the speed of your hardware, Calico will be there. So yeah, that's an example of eventual consistency, I suppose.
I mean,
Um,
even just looking at the number of replicas in a deployment. So you tell the deployment, I want 30 replicas, and then stuff happens under the Kubernetes covers, and eventually you end up with 30 replicas spread over your nodes.
mhm. Mapping it back to the conversation about physical hardware, um, one one reason I'm glad to not work in. So I remembered what I was going to say earlier as well. So I'm going to try and map these two things together. The first one is that when we're testing physical network kit, and you were mentioning about how you can, there's nothing to stop you from running a probe or whatever else on a switch. I find that to be a really interesting area, and an area that I don't entirely love, because when I used to administer networks, it greatly concerned me the fact that nowadays it is entirely possible to run workloads on your switches. And in the same way that I worry about how you secure a laptop when you can run things in its BIOS, UEFI BIOS or whatever, however you're supposed to pronounce that. I'm similarly concerned by the concept of running code, general purpose code in your switch, and what precisely might be running there and how you identify it and protect against it. So that's a concern for me. But
I sent you that link a few days ago of that SFP that you could put arbitrary code on.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the only saving grace of that. So for the people listening / watching, Lance shared a link to a pluggable optical transceiver that had a programmable component in it that could run general purpose code, meaning it could sniff, it could do whatever it wanted to, or alter the traffic. The saving grace for me was that it was physically larger than a normal SFP, at least, because you thought at least you'd hope it would get noticed because it would be sticking out a bit, but yeah, it concerns me.
It's a lot smaller than a server room.
Yeah. So to map the conversation back to Calico, when we were talking a minute ago about the challenges of software testing and networking with ASICs and so on, we have that space around XDP and around NIC acceleration, which obviously any performant Linux implementation may start to use these hardware features, and obviously as soon as you start to use those, that brings with it a load of challenges. Is there a space that we've started to look into to try to get visibility for testing that stuff, or do we just test against scenarios and see what happens?
We have a few examples of network cards like that. So yeah, so most of what we do testing wise is done in the cloud, and the minority of stuff that we can't possibly do in the cloud is that stuff.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, cool. And I think what the saving grace of that right now is that I don't think there are that many network cards that implement XDP in full in hardware. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you to know. Yeah, that's right. That's what I thought as well. Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to know the answer to that, but that was what I thought as well. Was just Mellanox. I might be wrong about that. These things change a lot. So we should probably talk a bit more about what the high level scenario is for our Calico testing. So if you could just kind of give us an overview of how we do test, yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Wow, that's such a big area. Okay, I can start off with general principles if that's.
Please, yeah.
So general principles are. I mean, the ultimate goal is that it just works for as many users as possible. And the search space here, the space of stuff that can go wrong, or stuff that can change, can vary. So it's just huge. Kernel versions on your nodes, the particular flavor of Linux or whatever, the processor architecture, the particular knobs and switches you have on enabled on Calico. So which data plane you're using, which whether you're running WireGuard for internode stuff, the number of ways for things to go. Oh, and Kubernetes version, very important.
And even nuanced things like what order the boxes came up in. Things that aren't part of the configuration, but are part of the transient state of the.
Yes. Now that sort of thing shouldn't matter too much because of the whole eventually consistent.
Yeah, got it.
Of things. But it's certainly a big area of testing is a big area of focus for us is robustness. So if you turn a box off and on, does it come back properly? If you just go around doing chaos monkey on the components, does everything sort itself out? Does it cause does it cause cascade failures? Does it that sort of thing? And in fact, those things are fun features whenever we're getting. So there's a few things. Oh goodness. Okay. I'm having one of those moments where there's so much to talk about.
Well, I can ask you a more targeted question if you like.
Let's see if I can. There's a couple of interesting things I'd like to get to. I think.
Yeah, go for it.
So automating as much as possible is important because you can't do regular releases if you don't automate as much as possible. Mm-hmm. There are some things you'll never be able to automate. So you can't automate testing of the docs because docs are inherently you need a human to read them and understand them or fail to understand them, which is much more useful as a bug. You need, and this is a thing that I quite often, Calico users feedback is really helpful for. Is if you hear a lot of users getting a step in the doc wrong, then clearly the doc isn't good enough.
Yes, for sure. And there's some. It matters how readable things are as well. I had I forget which session it was on. About a week ago, I was going through a live demo, and I found a mistake in our docs that I was fairly convinced at the time. In the live demo, I said, "Oh look, I found a mistake in our docs," and I was pretty convinced by it that I had. But I looked back at it later, and it wasn't a mistake. It was under the pressure of doing a live demo, I couldn't see it, and so that readability aspect as well. Sometimes it can just be the case that something. It's not that the doc is wrong, but it's just the choice of words could be better, or it
doesn't put the emphasis on the right thing, or it doesn't have a red box calling out that this thing is actually quite important.
Yeah.
Especially when like a decent chunk of your users, English isn't their first language.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So what do you think about? So we've kind of alluded to how there are an awful lot of deployment scenarios, and anyone who's tried to build data centers knows that you try to avoid snowflakes, right? You try to treat your servers like cattle, and you try to treat everything as you try to make things as vanilla as possible, so as to make things reproducible. But we don't have that luxury because we have to have an awful lot of integration. So we can try to do to integrate well. So how do we draw the line? We can't test every possible integration because our test cycles would become unmanageable. So how can/do/should we should we decide where we draw the line, or which things are explicitly tested and which things are not?
I'm going to turn that round slightly and say that where we can in the docs, we say what we test.
Right.
Like the range of Kubernetes releases that a particular version of Calico runs on, for example. So with the docs say we test these things, but actually it probably works on more than that. As a simple example. So I think it is tough. We can't test everything. We need to be explicit and open with users about what we do test. And as the main line changes, as node operating systems become popular and unpopular, we need to make sure that testing reflects reality for the majority of users. So we try and do what we consider to be the main lines, and this is where feedback from Calico users scores. We try to document what we do, and that's basically the principle.
Yeah, it's entirely reasonable. So yeah, look at what your users are using and document as much as possible so they know what has or hasn't been tested. Yeah, it seems entirely reasonable.
And it probably works on a whole load more things than our docs say it does, but we just can't guarantee it.
An interesting experience I had that sort of relates to that when and this is not something you and I have ever spoken about, I don't think. So so apologies for surprising you with it, but it's when I was chatting to you and Sean and I was a user, and I was still very early in my journey and I didn't really know what I was doing. I had some kind of issue, and I wish I could look back at what that issue was now, because I probably would know what the answer was straight away. But I found a command, I think it was Calico status, which you can actually run on the nodes, and it
Calico node status,
and it spits out a lot of fact about the box and calls out a lot of. At that time, it called out a lot of warnings, and the reality was it was an example of us being too specific in what we said would work. So it basically pointed me at a ton of things that weren't really a problem, which is interesting because it's the flip side of what you just described of kind of keeping a small scope in what you say will work, whereas actually broadly more will work if you know what you're doing enough, which I didn't at the time. So it's not a perfect science, but yeah, okay. And I mean, I feel like our reliability is actually really good, and I think a big part of that is the fact that it's BGP, IP tables, and to a lesser extent eBPF, but this is tested technology, and it's been well architected. The control plane, data plane separation, and all those kind of aspects of things, and well tested. What were you going to say?
It's difficult, isn't it? So, for a user that's experiencing a problem, so for someone who has a particular combination of things that causes Calico to just not work for them, as far as they know, it doesn't work on 100% of the examples of the setups.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And maybe they don't have maybe the Kubernetes distro is forced upon them. The nodes are forced on them. Maybe they don't have full control over the network on their on-prem system because that's run by someone else. And it's really important to remember that for those users, those bugs are like totally blocking. Despite the fact that it might be that it only happens on a very for a very small subset of users. For them, it's 100% of Calico scenarios don't work. So yeah, it's really difficult to we have to make sure that, and this is again the beauty of Calico users being able to talk to people and help them ideally through these things and make it work for them, usually by adjusting the settings, by switching the encapsulation, by doing something to help them out.
To tweak it over, yeah. You and I have spoken a few times. Something I really want to build, I really want to find the time to build, is a tool that does some basic tests. For example, testing which encapsulations are being allowed between nodes and to try to catch those common cases. I'm going to jump forward to another question in a second because it relates to that. I just noticed we had a message, not a question, but a hello from India. Which is quite. I'm old enough to still feel amazed that anyone in India is currently watching us, but hello back, and I hope you're enjoying it. If you do have any questions, feel free to shout them out. We, as I said earlier, we are really happy to be derailed. on that topic, Lance, about tooling to test and catch common scenarios, I was going to ask you what, if anything, an interested community member could take on that would aid our testing scenario. If you have one option, great. If you have different options depending on people's skill levels, that would be amazing. But obviously, that's a big ask. Obviously, there are people out there who are better coders than I am, who have enough time to help and are willing to do so, which is I'm amazingly thankful for. But equally, there are people who, like me, who can find problems but not necessarily fix them in a Golang. So.
It's a good question. One of the things we're trying to work on at the moment is making our testing more visible. So one of the fair criticism leveled at it is that actually we do a whole lot more testing, but it's all done in a CI provider that we can't open up to the world.
Right.
So it's really hard to see the results, and it's really hard to make it obvious what tests are running. And yeah, that's definitely a thing that we could improve. And yeah, definitely PR's welcome.
Do you have in your head an idea of what that improvement looks like, or is that something that someone should come and talk to you on Calico users about?
I think come and talk. Yeah, I mean, because our code's housed on GitHub, GitHub Actions is an obvious way to do this stuff. But yeah, it's it's very hard. Yeah, certainly. I feel like there's a certain class of questions that gets asked on Calico users. So there's a whole class of bug. Quite a lot of the time, people will come in and say, my pods between, my pods can't talk to each other, and there's definitely a flowchart of stuff you could work through. Try this, have a look for this, and so on. That would be, just documenting that would be awesome.
So it's almost like a fix that you've brought that up, but I'm actually working on a blog post at the moment specifically for our I promise you this was not discussed between Lance and I ahead of time, but I am working on a blog post about our eBPF data plane and kind of trying to get a flowchart. I was really impressed by Danielle, I forget his surname. He did a really good Kubernetes troubleshooting flowchart, and people love it because it's very visual, it's very easy to engage with, and I'm trying to create something similar for our eBPF data plane. You do quickly find that when you try to build a flowchart like this, you realize how you end up, if you're not careful, realizing that there are an awful lot of interesting branches that could come off, and it's if you had too many, it becomes unusable. So it's trying to decide which ones are the ones that really belong on there and which ones aren't. So that's something our users can do. It's if they want to, that would be amazing. And I'm gonna produce some content in that area. And the good thing about that is it doesn't require that you're a coder to be able to do that. Similarly, I have this ambition to create the tool that I was talking about. That kind of tests the conditions per node, but I'm struggling to get that off the ground at the moment with other commitments. But if anyone's interested in helping with that, talk to me on Calico users and we can talk it through. Cool. Lance, just to let you know, we're going to go for about another 5 minutes, I think, because you and I both have other meetings to run on to. So if anyone watching wants to ask us any questions while we're online, please do so. So let's have a look. Yeah.
You asked me a question a while back about how testing has changed.
Oh yeah.
The whole shift to agile and shift left that's happened, and the whole iterative thing, that led to a group of people coming up with who was it? Okay, I'm looking at my notes now. Karen Greaves and Samantha Lang came up with something called the Testing Manifesto to complement the Agile Manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's a series of like 5 principles that are awesome, basically.
I'm not familiar with this at all.
Aha, okay. So it basically says we value testing throughout over testing at the end, preventing bugs over finding bugs, testing understanding over checking functionality, building the best system over breaking the system, and team responsibility for quality over tester responsibility. And that very much underpins the way that our attitude to testing at Tigera.
Yeah, those are really good. And I think you actually said it yourself. It sounds very similar to the same mindset that Shift Left brings to security, isn't it?
Yes.
Bring those. Get testing as early into the product lifecycle as you can, so that you find things early. And a metaphor I used a long time ago when I talk about Shift Left was, it's like steering a ship, isn't it? The earlier you make the course alteration, the less severe it's likely to need to be.
Yes.
So it's
for us that means that I will, when a developer writes the design for a feature, I should go and review that design, and give them a test plan, based on what they say their feature is going to look like right up front, right at that point before they've written any code.
Yeah.
And remind them of the non-functional requirements. The what happens when you reboot a node? What happens when you do an upgrade? How do you abort an upgrade? How do you all that sort of ask those kind of pointed questions. And sometimes that can make a developer go back and say, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, this design's not going to work in that case." And it means that they can that you can prevent the bug being written in the first place, which is absolutely the ideal.
Yeah, for sure.
Finding bugs where the bug is down to the design being wrong at the end is no help to anybody.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to bring up something that I brought up, I'm pretty sure, on this podcast before, so I apologize for it. But I think the only counterpoint to that really is that sometimes you need to just get building something before you can fully understand what it is that you're capable of building. So I guess that doesn't preclude what you just said, though. All you just need to do is have almost like a defined prototyping stage, at which point you're playing, and that's fine. That you're not expecting to release that thing, and therefore you're just seeing what it is that you're capable of building.
And you could totally write UTs and FVs for that at that point, right up front, and then maybe those are the things that survive the prototype and go forward into the main thing as well. I believe that's the whole principle of test-driven development is you write your tests up front, and you define what all the interfaces between your code and the other people's code is, and you write test cases that exercise those interfaces. And then that's your the test is basically an implementation of a really detailed spec.
And that's essentially what we're doing in our testing, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Let me have a look at what I think. We've just got a couple of minutes. Let me see what if I've got one tiny question to squeeze in, or maybe we might call it there. This is a quick one. So I feel like our logging for Calico, and this is in keeping with an awful lot of open source projects, it can be quite verbose, and often you see things in there that point to things that aren't problems, that can look suspiciously like problems but aren't problems. And I think that with your expertise, it's easier for you to discount those. But myself, I've been at Tigera for a year, and so when I look at those logs, I still see things that I think, well, I'm not quite sure if that's okay or not. What's your general take on information density and testing, and how you deal with that verbosity? Is that something you want to dial down? Do you want to capture all of that?
It depends. So the general attitude towards logs, at least with Calico, and this is maybe a thing you should question you should do with Sean or Casey perhaps. But the general principle, and certainly something that carried over from our previous employer, was the logs should give you enough information. Just the logs alone should give you enough information to repro or to diagnose most bugs without having to turn on debug logging. And if so, that's for info level. So if Calico is producing too much logging, you can totally turn your log level up to warning. That's absolutely fine. But it will make diagnosing much more exciting later. So the idea, so the way it's supposed to be is that info level gives you enough to diagnose most bugs, and you use debug for particularly nasty or intricate bugs. But yeah, most of the time, info level should be enough.
So actually, I think really the answer in a way is what you just kind of alluded to, which is the key point is to get things into the right tier for different error level, for different errors to be assigned to the tier which they logically make sense at. Then the problem really comes when when something excessively verbose or it sneaks into the wrong tier. That's when you start to see the confusion. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's quite a good learning.
And the only sane way to test that. So whenever I'm testing, I will typically run with Stern in the background. So Stern, the tool, allows you to log from many pods at once. And so you can say, give me the logs from all of the pods in this namespace or all of the pods with this label. And it will just stream them and prefix them with the name of the pod and the container within the pod as well.
Yes, I remember you teaching me about Stern and several other people in Tigera as well. And I think if people watching get one valuable takeaway from this session, if nothing else, Stern is incredibly useful.
Stern is awesome.
For the reason
so run that in the background. Run that in the background in a window and have it streaming all of the logs, and then do whatever it is you're doing, and watch. And if hopefully you'll see bad stuff appear in the. Sorry, that's my tester point of view, where I'm trying to break everything. But yeah, so my goal for when I'm in bug finding mode is stream the logs, do the test action, and see if because that's another fun thing about Calico. So Calico has a lot of resilience built in. There's a lot of times it will hit an error and it will just try and recover. Sometimes that means that you've done something that causes an exception, a panic, or whatever it is, and Calico restarts fast enough that there's no kind of impact of that. And if you're not streaming the logs, you won't see it.
You wouldn't even know. Yeah, that is. We're already out of time actually, but that's an interesting, because there's two sides to that coin. It's almost like the conversation we've had before. I think Sean and I had this chat about this about where if you're permissive of problems, or if you deal with problems well enough, that in itself is something you need to be cautious of, so that you don't miss these things. Yeah, cool. I knew we would run out of time. We always do. So we're out of time. We have to dive. Otherwise, we'll have no time before for human being things before the next session. So Lance, it just remains to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you've got an awful lot of other commitments. So thanks so much for coming on. Anyone who's watching, there's a YouTube playlist of this and all the previous sessions. And each one has an agenda, so if there's particular things you think you may or may not be interested in, you can dive into those. And thank you so much for the viewers who've been on. We've had a few people throughout, and anyone who watches later on. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.